In this lecture, we're going to review the history of semiology, or as I also call it, the history of communication. So let's start at the beginning. After a similar lecture a few years ago, a student asked me why all of the communication professors always told the same boring story. Well, modern research believes that the average consumer needs to view an ad at least 7 to 8 times before it will really sink in. So that is why every professor tells you this, because this is important. As communication advances, so does our knowledge, and knowledge is power. Spoken language began before recorded history. The experts estimate that humans began speaking in around 50,000 BC. This is just an estimate. Humans didn't record at the time, history at the time, so history was only the things that were told around the nightly campfire. All the accomplishments and cautionary tales were passed on to the next generation verbally. No record that they left behind. If you've ever played that game called telephone or gossip or something like that, where a message is passed from one person to another by whispering in the next person's ear, it often resulted in garbled results. You can see why there are so many myths and legends that are just unbelievable. So the first um, actual recorded history is believed to have begun around 17,000 BC, whenever cave dwellers began drawing on their walls in their caves. In 1940, the Lascaux cave paintings were discovered in France. It was a spectacular discovery. The cave had been sealed off due to a cave-in for centuries, so this allowed the paintings to be preserved in pristine condition. The animals seemed to leap off the walls. Epic hunts were illustrated within the most rudimentary pigments. The creators drew what they saw. Here's a startling part. See, they drew all kinds of horses and animals with horns and birds and people and bows and arrows and antelopes and that sort of thing. But here's the really startling part. They drew what they saw, like rhinoceroses in France. Last time I checked, there aren't any rhinoceroses in France or Europe for that matter. So that asks the question, were there rhinoceroses at the time because the paintings were being made? Maybe the climate was so completely different that rhinoceroses had ventured up that far north. Or did the caveman travel to Africa? The closest habitat for rhinos today is in Liberia, which is over 4,200 miles from France. That is a hike. So we are now in the participation. So now we're at the portion of the lecture to get some more participation points. I want you to find a photograph or illustration of a rhino and upload that to Canvas. Remember, you'll get 5 points for each submission. Don't be left out. So the paintings in Lascaux were not the only things that were left by prehistoric people. There are petroglyphs and pictographs in Egypt, in Libya, in Algeria. I have to say that looks like Raider Red to me. I just think it does. What do y'all think? Um, there's a lot in Texas along some of the rivers like the Pecos and places like that on some sheer cliffs that there were some people left their mark. There's a lot in New Mexico, just west of Albuquerque. There's a whole area where all of these volcanic rocks are just piled up on this mountain, and there's just all kinds of images. Also, there's some in Utah, and I want to talk about this one for a second. This particular site is in the Canyonlands National Park, which is south of Moab. If you've ever been to Utah, you should definitely go to the Canyonlands. It's a very beautiful place. So this is an exposed cliff of solid rock that's really close to the highway. It's kind of a natural pathway. It's between two mountains and it's a nice flat area. And so that's where the road is as you're going into the park. So this is right off of the road. You can't miss it. So for thousands of years, people use this natural pathway to go from one place to another. And they wrote their news on this particular rock. So there you can see that there are things on top of other things. So they would tell stories, and people would come and they'd read the news and then they'd add their story to it. Because of that, they call this the newspaper rock. And it was because of its popularity with ancient people sending messages back and forth. But now, if you do that, if you try to do the same thing that all those ancient people did and leave your story, or people call it graffiti these days, you will have to pay a hefty fine. But it's really very interesting. You can actually stop and go out and look at it. I don't think you can actually touch it. It's too far off the road and there's a lot of trees and sticks and things. But anyway, it's a really interesting thing to see. So that was our language. That was our first language, was just pictographs. In 5000 BC, written language started being a thing. So let's look at some of these things. There was the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was a key to understanding a lot of the first writings, the ancient writings, because on the Rosetta Stone, you can see it's got several segments there on the right. You can see different types of writing. It had the same thing in different languages. So if you knew one language, you could decipher what the other languages were. So it was really like a key, a pivotal find that they found. So it's kind of like if you look at your assembly instructions, if you're putting together some IKEA furniture, there is going to be several different languages that's saying the same thing. So that's what the Rosetta Stone, who knows, it may have been an IKEA assembly instruction. So hieroglyphics was a very popular written language. The Egyptians wrote all over the place inside of their pyramids and that sort of thing. Um, a lot of their language had pictograph elements. The top line of this example has a lot of icons that are based on real objects. Um, so that was hieroglyphics. One of the written languages that was really very prolific was hieroglyphics. This was done in Egypt, and there were a lot of pictograph elements to their language. So let's just look at the evolution of the alphabet. The very top one has, on the very top left is it looks like it's a bull's head or something like that. It has horns on it. And as you travel down below to the next line, the Phoenician line, you can see that they've kind of simplified it. The archaic Greek simplified it more, and Latin more, and Roman made it into what we know today as modern language. So you can see that our alphabet today has its roots in pictographic language as well. So you notice that, like the Rosetta Stone was written on stone. That was about the only thing they had in order to record anything. Everything, they didn't have paper. So they in 105 BC, that is when paper was first started to be produced. And there was a plant in Egypt. It was thought to start in Egypt because they had a plant along the Nile River called papyrus. It even sounds like paper, doesn't it? And there's a font named Papyrus, and no serious designer ever uses papyrus. But anyway, designer joke. Sorry about that. There were other fibrous plants that they used to pound into paper and make it so that they could write things and not have to be a stone carver. They even used some animal skins. They called it vellum. Today, vellum is made out of plant fibers as well, but back in those days, uh, vellum was a skin of an animal, and those were all used for writing mediums. So there is a picture of papyrus growing along the Nile. It kind of just looks like a regular reed or something like that. So about 400 AD, books were being made in a very, very elaborate way, and they were called illuminated transcripts, manuscripts. They were called illuminated manuscripts. They were mainly for religious purposes, the Bible and etc. The monks of various religious orders were the creators of these beautiful pages by hand, lettering and painting each one individually. As you can see, it's very intricate. There's a better, you can actually see the brushstrokes and everything that they were doing. These books could take years to complete, and they were very expensive. And the only people who had access to them were the religious, the rich, and the rulers. They were the only ones who could afford them. The poor masses had to take their word, take the rich and the rulers and the religious people's word for what the manuscript said and what they meant. This was the medieval era or the Middle Ages. Rome fell in the 5th century and the Renaissance began in the 15th century. It was a really dark time. There was the Black Plague, there was starvation, and there was lots and lots of ignorance. So in 1450, the movable type was introduced. Gutenberg, that Johann Gutenberg in Germany, was the one who came out with this particular press. And now, movable type is what made this really interesting. That was the beginning of mass communication. Each individual letter or number was made into a little block that could be put in the right order to spell words and paragraphs and whole pages by hand. You could just move these letters in and make something printed that, and you could print lots and lots of multiple pages. So they were made out of lead and they could be put together to form a page as we know it. They applied ink and they stamped paper against those pieces of metal. Now remember, that has to all be backwards. Everything had to be backwards. So you had to be a really, very, very, you had to be an expert at doing that kind of thing to be able to work backwards like that. But the really fantastic part of it all is you could lay out a page, which might take you a few minutes, and then you could print as many pieces, as many copies as you wanted of it. So mass communication started with the movable type press. So you can see here's a better example of movable type. You can see those individual pieces, and there are some blank pieces of metal to keep it into place. And so that was a really big thing. So we are going to stop here so that I don't want the lecture videos to be very long. Next up is movable type, what we just talked about, to artificial intelligence. See you then.